Welcome to Study Hall, everybody. And today we're diving into something that might sound a little bit like, watching paint dry, the SIV Act, and how it could change voter registration. But stay with us, because this is about way more than just paperwork.
It really is.
This gets to the heart of who gets to vote in this country.
Mm-hmm.
How do we balance security with access? And we even end up in a bit of a digital spiderweb of information sharing. So
It's a fascinating topic, really.
it is, yeah, buckle up.
Yeah.
So we actually have not one, but two versions of the SIV Act to look at today.
Oh.
We've got H.R.22 and H.R.2281. It's kind of like two different classes, got the same assignment,
Right.
but they're working at different paces.
Uh-huh.
H.R.2281, this one's further along. It already passed the House in 2024, and now it's hanging out over in the Senate just waiting. And then H.R.22, which is the new kid on the block, just introduced this year.
Right.
So what do you think that tells us that we've got these two different versions floating around?
Well, it seems like this idea of changing the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which is what the SAVE Act is trying to do, it has some staying power. It's not going away.
Yeah.
Even if one bill kind of fizzles out, another one pops up.
It's like that game Whack-A-Mole.
Exactly.
But let's get down to brass tacks here. What is it that the SAVE Act actually wants to change?
Well, the big change, the core idea here is that both versions of the SAVE Act, they want to require everyone to prove that they're a U.S. citizen before they can register to vote in federal elections.
So right now, it's basically you just check a box and say, yep, I'm a citizen.
Pretty much, yeah. You're affirming that you're a citizen.
Right, and that's good enough. But this would add a whole other layer.
This is saying, okay, we want to see the receipts. We want to see the proof.
Show me the birth certificate, the passport.
Exactly. And it's not quite as simple as just, flashing your driver's license.
Oh.
The SAVE Act gets super specific about what counts as documentary proof.
Oh, really?
So like you said, a U.S. passport, that's definitely on the list, or a real ID compliant driver's license, the ones with the star.
Right.
Those are good.
Okay, so pretty standard stuff so far.
Yeah.
But what about people who don't have those specific things?
Well, the Act does address that, So, for example, tribal IDs,
Correct.
U.S. military IDs, those are also acceptable, but they might come with some extra paperwork.
Ah, okay, so a little more complicated.
Yeah. And things get really interesting when you look at the requirements for birth certificates. The SAVE Act wants a very detailed birth certificate.
Like how detailed are we talking?
We're talking names of both parents, the signature of the official who issued it, the date it was filed, the government seal, like the whole 9 yards.
Wow. So even if you have a birth certificate, it might not be good enough.
Exactly.
If it's missing one of these very specific details.
Right. And that raises questions, doesn't it?
That does.
About, how accessible are these documents, and could this actually end up disenfranchising people who maybe have older documents or just have trouble getting these records?
It seems like it could be a big hurdle for some folks.
It could be.
Yeah. And it's not just about registering in person either. This actually impacts mail-in voting, too.
Oh, absolutely. So think about this. You're applying for a driver's license, and at the same time, you want to register to vote right now. That's usually a pretty smooth process.
Yeah.
But under the SAVE Act, you're adding this citizenship check to the mix. And if you're registering by mail, well, you would have to send in proof of citizenship along with your application.
So more paperwork.
More paperwork, more potential for delays.
Right. So it's supposed to be convenient, but it could actually make things more complicated.
Potentially, yeah. Particularly for people who really rely on mail-in ballots, whether it's because of a disability, they live far away, or maybe they've got a super busy schedule.
Right, and this is just the beginning. This act goes even further. It creates this whole system of communication between state and federal agencies.
Yes, the digital spiderweb that we talked about.
Tell me more about that.
So basically, the states, they would be responsible for checking citizenship status. But to do that, they need information from the federal government. So you're talking about the Department of Homeland Security, the Social Security Administration, all these agencies roped in sharing data just to make sure that only citizens are on the voter rolls.
That's a huge operation.
It is. And the Act even says that federal agencies can't charge a fee for giving out this information.
Oh, wow.
So clearly, this is a big priority.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of moving pieces.
Definitely.
And what about people who can't get those documents right away? Like, what happens then?
Well, the Act does have something for that they can sign a statement saying that they are a citizen under penalty of perjury.
Oh.
and they can submit other evidence they might have.
Okay.
But then it's up to a local official to decide if that evidence is good enough.
So it's not an automatic no,
Yep.
but it's definitely another layer of scrutiny.
Exactly, and that official even has to sign an affidavit explaining their decision.
That is a lot of pressure.
It is. Imagine you're that official, you're looking at the stack of documents, and you have to decide someone's fate.
Yeah. And what happens if someone is found to be registered illegally?
Then things could get really serious. The Department of Homeland Security might get involved,
Oh.
potentially leading to investigations or even removal proceedings for non-citizens.
Those are some high stakes.
Very high stakes, and it really makes you think about the potential impact of this act.
Yeah. Could it actually end up hurting more people than it helps?
That's the question. Is this a necessary measure to protect election integrity, or is it going to disenfranchise legitimate voters?
It's a tough one.
It is.
So we've laid out the basics here, but there's so much more to unpack about the SAVE Act and its potential impact.
Right.
So stick with us as we continue this deep dive after the break.
Welcome back to Study Hall, where we are taking a deep dive into the SAVE Act and how it could reshape the way we vote in America.
And right before the break, we were talking about the possibility of this act leading to a lot more provisional ballots.
Yeah.
You know, those are the votes you cast when there are questions about whether you're eligible or not. It's kind of like getting sent to the principal's office.
Right.
You're just stuck in limbo until they figure things out.
Exactly. And with the SAVE Act focusing so much on these strict document requirements, it makes sense that more voters could end up in that uncertain situation. You can picture it, you show up at the polls, ready to do your civic duty, and boom, you're told your ID isn't good enough.
Ouch.
Or there's some issue with your registration.
Talk about adding insult to injury. You have to jump through all these hoops to register, and then you might hit a wall at the voting booth, too.
And it's not just a hassle for individual voters, this increase in provisional ballots.
Yeah.
It could create a logistical nightmare for election officials. It could slow down the counting process and even delay the results.
Oh, man. Remember those elections that come down to the wire?
Oh, yeah.
Just a handful of votes?
Right?
Imagine if you've got thousands of provisional ballots hanging in the ballots.
It really makes you wonder about how quickly we'll be able to know the results of elections, which is kind of a big deal for a democracy.
Right. And for the voters themselves, casting a provisional ballot can be nerve-wracking. You don't know if your vote will count.
Yeah, it's like turning in a big assignment and not knowing if the professor's even going to grade it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did I do it right?
Yeah.
Am I even registered? Those are not the questions you want running through your mind after you leave the polling place.
Definitely not. And it could lead to people feeling like their vote doesn't matter, feeling disenfranchised, and then they start to lose trust in the system, especially if those provisional ballots get tossed out because of some paperwork problem.
So it makes you think, is this fix actually worse than the problem it's trying to solve?
It's a good question.
Are we trying to stop voter fraud?
Right.
Which studies have shown is super rare at the expense of making it harder for legitimate voters and shaking people's faith in the whole election process.
It's a balancing act, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, it is. And speaking of complicated things, let's go back to that digital spiderweb of information sharing we mentioned earlier.
Ah, yes. The SAVE Act's grand plan to connect all these state and federal databases to verify citizenship.
It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. This
Yeah.
giant network of data flowing back and forth, watching every voter.
And while the act says that federal agencies can't charge a fee for giving out this information,
Right.
it doesn't really address the privacy issues that come with a system like this.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, where do we draw the line between making sure elections are fair and protecting people's privacy? Is all this data sharing really necessary, or are we heading into Big Brother territory?
It's a slippery slope, and we need to tread carefully. The right to vote, that's one of the most important pillars of our democracy.
Absolutely.
And we can't protect it by sacrificing our other freedoms.
Well said. All right, so let's shift gears for a bit and look at those two different versions of the SAVE Act we've got going on, H.R.22 and H.R.8281. It's like watching a legislative relay race. Each bill is trying to get to the finish line first.
Right. And that difference in timing, it could have a big impact on how these changes actually play out across the country. And remember how some states have those exemptions from certain parts of the National Voter Registration Act?
Okay, so we've got exemptions, deadlines, two bills at different stages. This is starting to feel like one of those brain teaser puzzles.
It can be a bit confusing.
Yeah, like who ate the last cookie? Can you break it down for us? What's the connection here?
Sure. So the SVRA Act, it has this part that lets states with existing exemptions choose whether they want to follow the new requirements.
So they don't have to do it right away.
Exactly. They have some flexibility to decide if and when they want to put these stricter rules into place.
And that flexibility is tied to when each version of the bill might become law.
Exactly. It just goes to show you that the ins and outs of how laws get made, they can have a ripple effect across the entire country.
Right.
Even something that seems like a small detail in a bill can end up having huge consequences.
It's like dominoes. You knock one over and they all start falling.
Exactly.
All right, so let's fast forward for a second and say one of these SAVE Act bills somehow makes it through the Senate lands on the president's desk.
Hold on, no, even then it's not a done deal.
Oh, right.
The president could still veto it, send it back to Congress for more debate.
So even if the House and the Senate are both on board, the president can still say nope.
That's the beauty of our system of checks and balances. No one branch has all the power.
Okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that the president does sign the SAVE Act into law. What happens to those states with exemptions? Are they off the hook?
Not completely. They have 60 days before the next federal election to figure out if they want to implement the new requirements.
So it's not a free pass.
No.
But they have a little bit of time to assess the situation.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this only applies to federal elections. States can still set their own rules for state and local elections.
Okay.
So the SAVE Act wouldn't necessarily create one set of rules for the entire country.
So you could have different rules depending on where you live.
Exactly. It's a prime example of how federal and state power work together and how even a national law can be put into practice in very different ways.
It really highlights how important it is to understand not just what the law says, but how it actually works in the real world.
It's like reading a recipe, the ingredients list. That's just the beginning.
Right.
The final dish depends on the skill of the chef, the quality of the ingredients, even the temperature of the oven.
Okay, I love the food analogies.
Yeah.
But you're right, the SAVE Act, if it becomes law, it wouldn't create a one-size-fits-all approach to voter registration. It would probably play out differently from state to state depending on their existing laws, their resources, and even the political climate.
It would.
It's a good reminder that even though we're talking about a national issue, the effects would be felt most strongly at the local level, where voters actually interact with the system.
Exactly. And speaking of voters, let's put our study hall participants to the test with a little pop quiz.
Ooh, I love a good pop quiz. All right, everyone, time to flex those brain muscles. Here's a multiple choice question. If the SAVE Act became law, which of these documents would not be good enough to prove you're a U.S. citizen?
Here are your options: a valid U.S. passport, a current student ID card with a photo, a real ID-compliant driver's license, or a U.S. military identification card. Choose wisely, folks. The answer will be revealed after a quick message.
We'll be right back with the solution to our citizenship puzzle.
Welcome back to Study Hall, where we've been putting your civic knowledge to the test with a little pop quiz all about the SAVE Act. Let's see if you were paying attention.
It's time to reveal the answer to our multiple choice question. Remember, we asked which document would not be acceptable as proof of U.S. citizenship under the SAVE Act.
You had to choose from a valid U.S. passport, a current student ID card with a photo, a real ID-compliant driver's license, or a U.S. military ID card. So what's the right answer?
If you chose B, a current student ID card with a photo, you are absolutely correct.
Give yourselves a pat on the back. Student IDs might be your ticket to the library and the dining hall.
But they wouldn't cut it as proof of citizenship under this act.
Nope, the SAVE Act is very specific, and it only lists passports, real ID licenses, and military IDs as acceptable forms of documentation.
Now, I know some of you are thinking, what about a birth certificate or a certificate of naturalization?
Good point.
Those could potentially work,
Yeah.
but there might be extra steps involved, like showing additional documents or meeting certain very specific requirements.
It really shows you how complicated this issue is and how confusing it could be for voters.
Yeah, it's like a game of bureaucratic hide and seek. You need the exact right document with the exact right information presented the exact right way
Exactly.
just to be able to vote.
It makes you think, is this really fair to expect everyone to have all these specific documents ready to go, especially if they've never had any problems voting before?
It raises those big questions about fairness and access.
It does.
Are we accidentally creating a system where only people who know how to navigate all this red tape
Right?
can actually participate in our democracy?
It's a big concern.
It really is. And it underscores why it's so important to dig into the details of this act, like we've been doing today.
Absolutely.
It's not just about understanding the technical stuff.
Right.
It's about understanding what the consequences could be for real people and for our democracy as a whole.
Well said. And as we wrap up our session today, I want to leave you with one final thought. We've been focusing on the SAVE Act and all its little details.
Yeah.
But let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture.
Like, what's driving this whole push for these stricter ID laws?
Exactly. What are the assumptions about voter fraud and election integrity that are fueling this legislation, and how does it all fit into the bigger story of voting rights in America?
Those are some heavy questions.
They are, but they're worth thinking about as engaged citizens.
You're right, because at the end of the day, our democracy depends on people being informed and participating. It's not enough to just vote. We need to understand the issues, what's at stake, what could happen because of the choices we make and how these policies affect us and our communities.
Absolutely. So keep those minds sharp, stay curious, and don't be afraid to think critically.
Your voice matters, your vote matters, and your understanding of the issues that are shaping our world matters. Thanks for joining us in Study Hall today.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.
Class dismissed.